Welcome to Joy for the Journey, the podcast where we explore the winding paths of purpose, faith, and joy. I'm your host, Joy, and I'm thrilled to embark on this transformative journey with you. Are you a woman seeking more than just existence and a soul yearning for fulfillment, purpose, and unwavering joy? Well, you're not alone. In this sacred space, we'll navigate the highs and lows, the doubts and triumphs, and the divine whispers guiding us toward our true calling. Through candid conversations, inspiring stories, and practical insights, Joy for the Journey is your compass, your confidant, and your catalyst for embracing the abundant life God intends for you. So if you're ready to reclaim your joy, renew your hope, and rediscover the woman God created you to be, join me on this adventure. Let's walk together step by step towards a life filled with purpose, passion, and unbridled joy. This is Joy for the Journey. Welcome aboard. Hey, and welcome to Joy for the Journey. I'm Joy Jackson, and I'm so excited that you are continuing this journey with me. We are having a ball talking about all things as it relates to the journey. And the reason I love this and this time with you is because we are exploring all aspects of the journey. We've talked about so many things, and I think when we're talking about purpose and the journey of self-discovery, we forget that we're total people with total emotions and total ideas and total thoughts and total successes and total failures and total fears. And so this is an opportunity and a place where we can talk about all of those things. And so this topic is one that has become a buzzword in society in general. And I want to talk about it because I want to applaud those who understand it. I want to help those who are trying to do it but don't understand it. And then I want to kind of share my point of view on why it's important and how to make it work for you. And that's boundaries. Man, if you have talked to anyone in this season of our lives, there are so many people who are saying, I'm setting boundaries, or girl, you need to set some boundaries, or your therapist is talking about boundaries. But I think we need to really understand what boundaries are. I think we really need to understand how they work, what their benefit is, how to implement them, and then what to do when people violate them. So many times we hear that we need to set boundaries, but that's as far as it goes. So now we're creating these walls and these barriers, calling them boundaries, and then we wonder why we're alone, or we wonder why we're still being violated. I truly believe it's because we have not really understood how boundaries work. First, I want to give you a scripture that I think helps understand boundaries, and that's Proverbs 4:23. And it says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. I think when we really start to define boundaries, we've got to look at boundaries as a heart thing. We've got to look at boundaries as a way to protect ourselves. And the most valuable possession that we own, of course, is our spirit. And I'm going to equate for the purposes of this conversation the spirit and the heart, although we know man is three parts, right? Body, soul, and spirit. I want to talk about how all of that has to be protected in order for us to walk out the purpose God has for us. And so I believe when we talk about boundaries, that's really what we're talking about, is guarding ourselves and guarding our heart, because everything flows from it. Part of the reason why some of us are violated and some of us are hurt is because of the fact that we have not guarded our heart. It's a lady that I have worked with before, and she said it many times, and I say it quite often. You got to guard your gates. You've got to guard your gates all the time. It's kind of like the guards that are at the Royal Palace. Their goal is to guard the gates all of the time. They don't smile. They don't take selfies. They don't take breaks. They literally are there to guard the gates. You know why? Because there's something precious on the inside. The queen, the king, the royal family's on the inside. And so their job is to stay there and protect the treasure that's inside. So when we think about boundaries, I want us to think about them from that perspective. The goal of boundaries is to protect what's inside. The goal of boundaries is not just to put some stuff up because that's what people say that we should do. They are really designed for us to find our mental health, our well-being, and all of the things that help us move to where God wants us to be. So when I talk about boundaries, they're guidelines or limits that you create to identify reasonable, safe, and permissible ways for others to behave toward them, not toward you. Because we can be funny acting, we can be difficult, we can be a lot of things. And if we're operating and setting boundaries based on what we want and the way that we think we should act, every time the wind blows, so do our boundaries. And then we wonder why people are scared to approach us. We wonder why people are afraid or don't even know how to communicate with us or interact with us. It's because we keep changing our boundaries. Now, I know you're going to say, Joy, that's my right. And it is. But then when people violate them, you got to be prepared for that because they may not have even understood what the boundaries were in the first place. But we'll get there. So when we talk about boundaries, they are reasonable and safe and permissible ways that people interact with them. So it's not about setting all these boundaries that are so difficult that people can't follow. It's really about setting ways that people can interact with you based upon what the guidelines are that you set. But then here's the best part of this definition and how you will respond once someone passes the limits. I truly believe that we live right now where everybody's setting boundaries, but nobody sets the consequences for violating the boundaries. Or the consequences will come and go depending on how we feel or who we're interacting with or what we think is appropriate at the time. But the truth is, boundaries, we're going to set the guidelines and the limits, but we're also going to set the consequences for violating those boundaries. And I think that's super important because the boundaries are crucial and they help me maintain my health, my well-being, and my integrity. So what kind of boundaries are there? There are physical boundaries. There are emotional boundaries. There can be digital boundaries. They can be spiritual boundaries. You name it, there's probably a boundary that you can create for it. Because it's really about communicating your needs. Not what you don't want people to do, but the needs that you have that have caused you to set this area of protection. And the purpose of the boundary is so that you're not exploited or harmed. The purpose of the boundary is not for you to just say, you better not cross this line. Remember when we were younger, people would step and draw a line with their feet and say, don't cross this line. And if you cross this line, you know what's going to happen. That's really not the purpose of boundaries. It's to protect you so that you're not harmed. And when you establish them and maintain them, there's a level of respect that takes place in boundaries and a level of respect in healthy relationships when boundaries are set. As we look at boundaries and as we talk more about boundaries through this session, I want you to think about boundaries that way. I want you to think about boundaries as a way to guard your heart, as a way to guard your spirit. And you don't let any and everybody access to your heart. I'll say it like this. Many of us probably know what we should and should not be eating. If you want to lose weight, if you want to be healthy, you know what you should and should not be eating because you want to protect your heart. And you are mindful, even if you don't practice it, you're mindful of what goes in your body. The same thing should be about boundaries. And when you realize that's out of whack, that's when you begin to set boundaries. So the first thing to note about boundaries is boundaries are not selfish. So some people worry about setting boundaries because they feel like they're being selfish. And I'm going to give you permission that if it's time for you to set some boundaries, that's not a selfish act. In fact, boundaries are a form of, and I don't really care for this word, but they're a form of self-care. They're a form of self-respect. Because when I set boundaries and I create some guidelines for how people interact with me, that shows that I value myself and I value my worth. It also shows that I value my well-being. So then when I face the world, I can face the world with positivity. I can face the world constructively. I can face the world in a healthy way because I have set some parameters for myself. Now, most of the times, the people that you begin to set boundaries with will call you selfish. And usually that's because they've always had access to you. Usually because they've always been able to maintain the way that they've wanted to maintain. Usually because they're used to you showing up the way they've always expected. So the first word that they'll probably call you is selfish. And I challenge you to say, no, I'm not being selfish. I'm being self-aware. No, I'm not being selfish. I am showing self-respect. No, I'm not being selfish. I am showing self-care because it's important for me to be healthy along this journey. And it's hard for me to do that if I don't set some boundaries. The second thing about boundaries should not be manipulative. Sometimes people use boundaries as a way to control. So if I set this boundary, then you'll do what I want you to do. If I set this boundary, then I'll get you to operate that way I want you to operate. I shouldn't be setting boundaries to get people to do the things I want them to do. Because here's the truth. I can set a boundary, but it's up to you on whether or not you follow it. And so my job should not be to put you in a box to force you to follow my rules. It's really about me saying, here's what's healthy and best and well for me. And here's what I hope you will respect about it. And that's a very big difference. So when you're setting boundaries, I don't want you to always set boundaries with a specific person in mind. Like, yeah, I don't want this person doing this, so I'm going to set this boundary. No, this is important to me. These are my needs, and this is why I'm setting the boundary. Hopefully you see the difference there. And then I say this because this is one that just kind of gets under my skin. Boundaries aren't rigid barriers. They're not something super rigid, super difficult, super structured that you just got to stay that way. They were not created for that reason. Boundaries were not created to be so rigid that they separate you. Now, if there are some things and some people you need to separate from, don't make that about a boundary, baby. Just flee. Just get to where you need to be away from that person if that's it. But boundaries are not about creating that distance, and they can be flexible and adjusted as the relationship grows, as situations change. I'm telling you, I know so many women who've set these boundaries and they've been so busy building boundaries that they've built walls. And now they have no friends. Now they don't have loved ones or interactions or relationships with certain people because you're setting this boundary and you're setting it with the idea of protecting yourself. But you also have the ability to extend grace. You also have the ability to choose. So even though you set this boundary, you have control over changing it. So I don't want you to get so rigid that you're like, I can never change this boundary. It's always got to be like this. Nothing else can change. And I've got to keep it in place forever. Because remember, boundaries are about limits. So sometimes people won't actually violate the boundary. They just get close to the limits. And so you want to always give people grace. You always want to understand that your boundaries were not put in place to necessarily keep them out forever, but to protect yourself. So when you take boundaries out of focus and bring it in focus, then you feel comfortable if and when you decide to be flexible on your boundaries. And in a way, when you do that, especially when you see that you can loosen the reins a little bit, it shows a level of respect for the people that you're working with, for the people that you love, for the people that you're interacting with. And it builds understanding. So don't be so rigid that you're not flexible and fluid, because the honesty is you have the power to change the boundaries. And so I want you to really understand the true purpose of boundaries because they're really about a healthier self. The final thing to know about boundaries is that boundaries are not put in place to punish people. If you are creating boundaries to punish people, your boundaries will be ineffective. And then they build up resentment, then they build up anger, then they build up frustration because you created the boundary for the wrong reason. Instead of thinking about punishing them, think about protecting you. Because punishing them is about their behavior. Protecting you is about your behavior. Here's what I mean by that. You don't have a boundary in place for a certain situation. But then all of a sudden, someone does something that you don't like, and then you suddenly set a boundary. You may say, well, that's not on me. I'm not too concerned about that. I have to do what I have to do to protect myself. I agree with that. And I believe in situations where there is a true need for a boundary that's understood and justified. But if you've put up a boundary just because you're angry, if you put up a boundary just because you're frustrated, then I would say before you set that boundary, search your heart. Search your mind, search your motives to make sure that the purpose of the boundary is really for your protection and not for punishment. When you're really setting boundaries, it should be proactive. It should be based on what you already know you need, not reactive. Now, yes, there may be times that we have to do some reactive boundaries. But if I'm really on this journey and I'm searching for my emotional health and I'm trying to walk in a peaceful and a joyous environment, I don't wait till I'm violated to set a boundary. I'm already setting boundaries even before a violation occurs. That way I know the boundaries are really about protecting me, protecting my heart, protecting my joy, protecting my peace. We set a boundary when our peace is violated. Oh, no, they violated my peace. So now we're setting a boundary. Or no, they offended me. So now we're setting a boundary, which looks like punishment, but also causes us to struggle when it's time to enforce it. Because now our mood has changed. Now we feel differently. Now we're no longer upset. Now we're no longer frustrated. And then we're like, oh, don't worry about it. It's okay. And then that's where the confusion starts. And that's where the anger comes when our boundary is violated again. So make sure when you're setting your boundaries that you're doing it from a place, again, of wellness. So let's talk the truth. What do you do when people violate your boundaries? Because here's the thing. We don't talk about that. We talk a lot about setting boundaries, but we don't talk about how to handle people who violate them. And let me tell you, there will be some violators, intentional and unintentional, but there will be some violators. So what do you do when people violate? I got a couple of ideas. These are mine. I also say, find the ones that work for you, tried and true, but these are some of the ones that I do because I think they come from a healed and healthy place. One thing that people will say that I argue is that you don't have to communicate your boundaries. Well, here's what I say. If I don't know you have a boundary, then how do I know if I crossed it? So I believe that you got to communicate your boundaries. And I'll tell you how you communicate them in a second, but I believe you got to communicate them. I believe you got to tell people what your boundaries are so that they can be aware. Because I truly believe that most of the people in the world aren't out here trying to violate your boundaries. But if they don't know you have them, then how can they not violate them? So I think you have to clearly and calmly explain what your boundaries are. But I think the key to that is explaining why that boundary is important. I think the key to that is communicating your needs when you express your boundaries. I think the key to that is being fully transparent about why that boundary is being set. I don't think you can just say, oh, I'm not fooling with them because they keep violating my boundaries. And the person doesn't even know you got boundaries. And you know why they don't know you got boundaries? Because you just started setting them. You know why they don't know you have boundaries? Because they've never seen you implement a boundary in anything else. You know why they don't know you have boundaries? Because they've never seen you put up guardrails for anyone else. So they may not know. And then you're walking around angry with them because you feel like that they don't get you, they don't understand you, but they had no idea. But I think if you communicate your boundaries from a place that is clear and that is transparent and that is focused on your needs, then when a person crosses the boundary, you can have a different conversation. The conversation is not, you be violating my boundaries. I don't like how you treat me. Now it's, when we spoke, I mentioned to you that this was important to me. And because this was important to me, I put this in place. And what I'm noticing is that you continue to do this. Here's an example. This may seem kind of crazy to you, but one of my true boundaries is dishonesty. And baby, I'm not just talking about little white lies. I'm talking about people who just flat out don't tell the truth. And I'll pause here and say, because I pray about the friends I have and the relationships and the individuals, I can tell you that the Holy Spirit gives me discernment. So there are times that I know people are just absolutely lying to me and I can't take it. And so when I meet people, especially when I get into relationship with them, that's one of the things that I tell them. I don't do liars. I just don't. I don't like it. It bothers me. It irritates me. And if you begin to lie to me and I feel like I can't trust you, I cannot continue in a relationship with you. So there's the boundary. I didn't have to say the word boundary. I didn't have to hashtag boundaries. I just communicated my need. I have a need to be vulnerable and transparent and authentic with the people I'm in relationship with. So that means that I'm not comfortable around people who don't trust me enough to be honest with me. If you choose to be dishonest with me, then our relationship is severed. That's a boundary. And that's nothing about that person I'm talking to. It has everything to do with me. And me communicating that allows a person to make a choice at that point, because when you set a boundary and you communicate it, you give people an opportunity to make a choice. Do they want to support the boundary and adhere to it, or are they going to flee? I've had some friends who fled. I've had some friends who stayed. But when I stopped calling, when I stopped coming around, when I stopped wanting to spend time with you, you don't have to guess what happened. You violated the boundary. Doesn't mean I'll never talk to you again. It just means the level of intimacy that we share will no longer exist. So when you're clearly communicating your boundaries, make sure you focus on your needs. What's your why for creating this boundary? I promise you, if you can communicate it that way, then people are not offended when you set the boundary. And I know you don't have to tell people a boundary, but if you're going to live in a world and be in relationship with people, the best thing you can do is to communicate clearly your needs so that they can make decisions going forward. Another thing that people don't really talk about is, how do you handle people who cross boundaries? You evaluate the boundary because you have the power to adjust the boundary if needed. So you may want to adjust it because it wasn't clear enough. I may have to come back to that same friend and say, hey, listen, I believe that you haven't been honest with me. And for me, dishonesty is a deal breaker. And so, what I mean by dishonesty is X, Y, and Z. So you may have to go back to adjust it to make it more clear so that people can truly understand it. People aren't in your head as you're setting your boundaries. So when you communicate them, it may sound good to you. But then as you start to see it in action, you may need to change it. You may need to change how you communicate it. You may need to even alter the limits. If it's a person that I really value, I may not be one and done with them. I may say, well, listen, I didn't feel like you were being honest and I wanted to bring it to your attention to give them the opportunity to talk to me and explain where they are. And then from there, we can make decisions together. I can choose how I continue the relationship. So that's the real thing about setting boundaries is I get to adjust them because they are based on me. So maybe as I grow, maybe as I heal, maybe as I mature, then certain boundaries that I've set, I can loosen the guardrails a little bit, or I can even change for that matter. Another thing is to really set consequences. Like you heard me say in my example, I'll sever the relationship. And I say that to people. But if they continuously disrespect, what are you prepared to do? And I'm talking, what is the limit? What is the absolute threshold that you will not tolerate? And then I want you to create some gradual limits there because some of us are the one and done kind of people. And the minute somebody violates, we're, oh, done with you. And whereas you could choose to live that way, first, that's not grace and that's not God. Let's just call it what it is. That's not grace and that's not God. People make mistakes. People are flawed. Human beings are going to do human things and they're going to human. So to set these boundaries that are so unrealistic and that are so far out that if anybody gets close to it, they fall off the ledge, that's kind of hard. And that's not how God does you. God has set some limits and some boundaries, and we violate those things every day. So I want you to remember that you don't have to be one and done with people. So you can actually create gradual steps toward that final cutoff or that final breakdown. But when you set the consequences, it's not about punishment. It's about taking a stand and being clear on what will happen if your limits are not respected. Again, it has nothing to do with that person. It has everything to do with you. And so many times we're not comfortable setting consequences. So many times we're good at telling people what they can and cannot do as it relates to us, but then we're not ready to pull the trigger when they do it. And then I think when we talk about consequences too, it's important for us to communicate the consequences as it relates to what we're going to do, not what we expect somebody else to do. So if I continue to find someone who violates my boundary of dishonesty, I can't ask them to change who they are. I can't say, well, I just want you to be this type of friend. And if you would do that, we would be better friends. No, this is what's important to me. And if you violate it, here's what I'm going to do. So the consequence is administered by me, and it is not on the person to do anything. I really think we take the cowardly way out. We want the boundary, and then we want them to punish themselves. That's not how that works. First, because it's not punishment. But then secondly, because it's not that person's responsibility to implement a consequence. I mean, who in their right mind would put a consequence on themselves for something they do? We don't like consequences. So that's why it's important for you to make sure you know what those consequences are and that you've clearly communicated them. And then the last one is sometimes just reflect. If your boundaries are frequently being crossed, identify the relationship, identify the person, but also identify yourself. Remember, these boundaries aren't about other people, they're about you. So if the boundary keeps being crossed, what is happening? The reason the boundary keeps getting crossed. Maybe you've given them too much access to you. Maybe you haven't clearly communicated the boundary. Maybe you haven't clearly communicated the consequence. Or maybe you haven't even really implemented the consequence. So when you're talking about boundaries, when you're talking about setting limits and guidelines, you've got to always go back and think about them. You've got to always replay them to make sure that they are being executed in a way that's healthy for you. And the healthier you become, the more your boundaries may change. So I think it's important for you to remember that you don't have to stay with the boundaries that you're setting today. You have the ability to change. So when you're setting boundaries now, when you're considering setting boundaries, remember this. Remember that it's about guarding you and protecting you. It's about guarding the treasure that's inside of you, not just making it something for everyone else. It's about you and what you need to continue the journey. So I challenge you to think about your boundaries right now. What are they? And then how are they serving you? Are they helping you become a better woman? Are they helping you get to the place that you need to be? Are they really the types of boundaries that are going to grow you and mature you and make you better? If not, it's not too late to change them. But if you love the boundaries that you set and you're comfortable with them, it's time to communicate them so that there's a level of mutual respect between you and anyone that you have in your circle. I hope that helps you. Talk to you soon. Welcome to Joy for the Journey, the podcast where we explore the winding paths of purpose, faith, and joy. I'm your host, Joy, and I'm thrilled to embark on this transformative journey with you. Are you a woman seeking more than just existence and a soul yearning for fulfillment, purpose, and unwavering joy? Well, you're not alone. In this sacred space, we'll navigate the highs and lows, the doubts and triumphs, and the divine whispers guiding us toward our true calling. Through candid conversations, inspiring stories, and practical insights, Joy for the Journey is your compass, your confidant, and your catalyst for embracing the abundant life God intends for you. So if you're ready to reclaim your joy, renew your hope, and rediscover the woman God created you to be, join me on this adventure. Let's walk together step by step towards a life filled with purpose, passion, and unbridled joy. This is Joy for the Journey. Welcome aboard.